The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar podcast. Probably one of the biggest news weeks in between two sets of podcasts for us in the entirety of the time we've been recording this show. So we'll definitely get straight into things and try and answer all of the questions that we've been sort of sent, or all of the questions that have been raised from all of these topics. So just to give you an outline of what we have on this week's show, we have some reaction to Penske's disqualification from St. Petersburg with Scott McLaughlin and Josef Newgarden. We've obviously got a roundup of what happened in Barber with Scott McLaughlin rebounding for Penske and winning the race. We've got David Malukas being dropped from his Arrow McLaren drive and replacement TBC, so we'll get into that. And we'll try and round up some of the other interesting news stories from Barber. Unfortunately, Barber's going to go, it's not going to get the same level of analysis and treatment that it usually gets from us in a kind of post-race podcast show, because there's just so much to get through in terms of the news cycle this time. So yeah, we'll crack straight into it. Got JR Hildebrand alongside with me as always to bring you the latest episode of the show. And yeah, the Penske controversy, we've not had a chance to address this because our previous show came out on Tuesday or Wednesday last week, just before the news dropped. So we'd already recorded at the time of that news coming out. If you haven't seen it, which I'm sure if you're listening to this show, you probably will have been well aware of all of what's going on, but just in case you aren't, we had Josef Newgarden disqualified from his race win at St. Petersburg, and Scott McLaughlin also disqualified from his podium finish for using push-to-pass on restarts in that St. Petersburg race. Big controversy. Will Power also fined 10 points. He wasn't actually disqualified because he didn't use the push to pass on the restarts, but still received a kind of team-wide penalty in terms of those points being dropped because he had the ability to use it, he just chose not to. This has all stemmed from a hybrid test where Penske say that a line of code wasn't changed, and yeah, basically where push to pass was unlimited at that hybrid test, it's obviously not in a race. And the reason it took so long to find, pretty much a month after St. Pete race was because of some sort of weird glitch in race control in the Long Beach warm-up, where all of the push to pass didn't work apart from the 3 Penske cars. So that's how they kind of figured it all out. So yeah, big story in the aftermath. We had Scott McLaughlin and Will Power both put out statements. Scott McLaughlin kind of highlighting that he'd only used the push to pass for 1.9 seconds, and once he realized that the push to pass was working, he didn't press it again. Josef Newgarden was a bit more complicated. He decided to do a press conference just before the Barber race, where he fought back tears, talking about how he knew what he was doing and that he'd kind of made the choice to use the push to pass, but maintained that he hadn't realized that the rules hadn't changed, because his team, at least Josef's side of the story is that his team were sort of believed that the push to pass was allowed to be used on restarts because of a rule change that they thought that had happened but hadn't happened. So a big complicated story, and lots of reaction from the paddock. Penske being called liars and cheats by a lot of people in the paddock. A lot of people not really happy about the fact that, you know, Penske's umbrella company, Penske Entertainment, owns the IndyCar series, and also obviously Penske team competes in IndyCar. So a kind of murky separation of church and state there, and that's obviously raised some questions as well. So that dominated the news cycle in the lead up to the Barber race. So I guess that's what happened. JR, you tweeted about this, and you replied to a few people who tweeted to you as well in kind of how you summed all of this up. And I guess the fundamentals of this story are, to me at least, and this is going to massively oversimplify things to the point where I'm probably doing the story a bit of a disservice. But if Penske have cheated, as people have accused them of, then if they hadn't told Scott McLaughlin and Will Power and Josef Newgarden, although they'd obviously thought that there was some sort of rule change going on, that they were able to use the push to pass on the restarts, then why would they do it? Because the drivers are the only people who can push the button in the car. So if you're going to develop some sort of move around the rules when it comes to push to pass, then the people who absolutely need to be told about that kind of change of situation is the drivers, because they're the people who push the button. Now, obviously there's, people have picked holes in Josef's story, especially about some of the things that he said in his press conference before Barber. And obviously the 2 other drivers haven't really, Will didn't use the push to pass and Scott only used it for 1.9 seconds. But the bit that I just kind of keep coming back to on this and keep simplifying it down to is the fact that, that the drivers are the key, that they are the key aspect here. They're the ones who need to know about this and be the key ones, because they're the ones pushing the button. So that's the kind of most interesting and unusual aspect of this whole story for me. Do you want to give us your thoughts on it, and then we can kind of dive into a little bit more detail if we need to?
Yeah, I think my thought on this is basically that if you were really going to do this, if this was premeditated and you knew that you had this ability to do something that the other guys can't do, and you were intending to use it in such a way that like you were going to be able to really genuinely gain an advantage from it, we wouldn't have known that it was happening. Like, there are ways to do this where, because of where the buttons are on the steering wheel, the way that you can activate push to pass in some other way, you could like redesign honestly, Penske, because they have the resources to do this, they would have completely redesigned the steering wheel so there was a button like on the back of the steering wheel somewhere that you couldn't see, that nobody would have any idea that they would have figured out how to trick the entire system so that there was no possible way to see that they were doing this, right? Or some version of that, right? Like, it would not, there have been, and I don't know if the statute of limitations is up on this, so I'm not going to go into like really heavy detail, but there have been situations where stuff like that did occur within the IndyCar series, like within the last 10 or 12 years or something, like this engine formula, where it's like full on cheat code status. Like, you're using weird code words over the radio. Like, there's all kinds of stuff to make sure that either the other manufacturer or other teams or whatever don't know exactly what you're doing. That has been the case for even such things as legal use of different like engine maps and stuff like that. So I guess the main thing, like this turns into just debunking conspiracy theory, basically. Like the main thing that I'm focused on with this is the way they did this. Like there's a lot of people saying that this was like a deeply like conspired, breaking of the rules. If you were that thoughtful about this deeply conspired breaking of the rules, you wouldn't be this like unthoughtful about how you actually deployed breaking the rules. So I guess that's to at least try to address the the sort of tinfoil hat theory that like Penske owns the series, and so somehow that has something to do with this, and that they're getting special treatment, and somehow that enabled them to from 6 months ago start developing this mechanism for cheating in a race and blah 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 blah. Like, I guess there's another part of this which is it's altogether kind of an insignificant performance advantage. Like there are other things that would be far more useful, basically, in terms of the advantage that you'd gain than this. I can also appreciate like that all by itself is not a lone judgment one way or the other, because anything in the IndyCar series at this point you could deem it a significant advantage. Like having push to pass in this situation is there's potential for you to gain a position or two worth of track position by having it when other guys don't, and that can be the difference between you finishing first and third, or third and fifth, and whatever in a race. So I think I guess I'm kind of selling that just all by itself as a argument against this being more scandalous or something. But I think the thing that really stands out to me is just like they were like talking live over the radio about being prepared to use push to pass on the upcoming restart, and then just pressing the normal button and using it like the normal way. I guess that, so there's a part of that which is it was possible for somebody to know that they were doing this as it was happening during the race, and just nobody, whether we're talking about IndyCar or other teams or whatever, just nobody was paying enough attention to recognize that was happening. Like that's not how you cheat, and that's certainly not like if you were going to be a Penske level cheater, you definitely don't do it that obviously. So that's really the primary reason that I'm willing to kind of bite on the rest of the explanation here from Penske, which is in essence that we just screwed up and like forgot that this was there, and there was enough. So the other explanation is in essence based on this offseason has been such a cluster between hybrid stuff and thermal and discussions about rule changes and all of this stuff that we just kind of like got confused or convinced ourselves that this was how this was going to work, and then we had the option to do it, and it worked, and so we just didn't really like think twice about it. That also sounds like a little bit of a tall tale, like to say that this was all that internally within the team and everywhere else around these guys and the team, that there's enough of a lack of communication that nobody like thought to consider the fact that this wasn't what was happening for everybody. So that's where we get into, I think the truth is probably somewhere in between these scenarios, which is that like maybe they had convinced that I think it's fair enough. It's reasonable enough to say that they had convinced themselves that there was like some rules change, and that maybe there's not a high degree of, communication that go like this. This would not be something that in like, I've never been in a pre-race meeting or something and actually talked about this. And it's not like the Penske drivers are all like Josef doesn't live in Charlotte. He's not like hanging out with his team every day. This is not, it's very possible that he's, for all intents and purpose, like that the drivers are kind of just showing up to the track. Like even in Indy, it's not like Scott Dixon, just because he lives in Indianapolis, is hanging out at the shop, like shooting the shit about a bunch of random stuff. Like he's off living his life. He's got 3 kids, whatever. Josef, these guys are all kind of in the same similar position. So I guess I would just say that, like, do I sort of think it's hard to believe that nobody knew or realized sooner than they said something about it that they had that they were in a different situation than other teams were in terms of their push to pass situation. I think that's kind of hard to believe. But do I think that this was do I think it's entirely possible that they didn't like knowingly, purposefully do this in the race, and that just kind of happened because of this mashup of weird situations that has gone on over the off season? Like unfortunately, like, just, I hate to be the one that's kind of just throwing cold water on all of this, but that's entirely plausible here, and basically until we find out that there was somebody that was truly aware of all of this and knew for sure that this was not the way that things were supposed to work and planned in advance to take advantage of it, then there's just not, in my mind, there's not like a lot more that we can say about it. I mean, again, it all comes back to, like, if you were really trying to cheat here, like if this was not just, there's a different version of this, which was just kind of an in the moment, like, oh, sweet, like this is working, which any driver would just keep pressing the damn thing if that was the case, because you'd kind of just assume that everybody else is on the same page. That, like, it doesn't really all, it makes at least as little sense if they were trying to do it than if they weren't.
It's a really bad way to bend the rules if that's what you're trying to do. And to be fair, even Josef Newgarden said that he understood that people found it ridiculous to believe the story, and he was the first one to kind of hold his hands up and say that he understands if people don't get the story. And he told us, he told a tale of how Jay Fry asked the IndyCar president, asked him to go and meet him, and Josef said he was telling him the story of what happened from his point of view, and that he was looking at Jay Fry, and it was clear that Jay didn't, well, at least Josef thought that Jay didn't believe him and couldn't get his head around this kind of chain of events. And Josef was like, well, if this guy doesn't believe me, then no one's going to believe me. The reason why I think it's difficult for people to get their heads around is because that two separate bizarre things needed to come together for this to be able to be the case, in that Josef needed to convince himself and his team needed to convince him that the rules are changed and that he was able to use push to pass, and this line of code needed to be somehow miraculously like left on the car from a hybrid test. And the level of coincidence for those two things to combine at the same time are just like almost too ridiculous for people to accept and believe. So I understand that part of the narrative here and why people are finding this so difficult to understand. I think the other thing is, like, Josef said he continued to push the button. Like, once he was aware of this happening, he's not tried to cover anything up or when he's been asked about this kind of stuff, he's just said from his point of view what's kind of happened. And I know it's really difficult to believe, but if you were an IndyCar team trying to do something that was, not by the book, then this is a really awful way to do it, and a very obvious way to get caught when people can look at your steering wheel and see what you're doing, as you quite rightly pointed out, and speaking on the radio. And I guess the other element of this is the other thing that is making people a bit confused about this, maybe, or kind of supporting that narrative that this was premeditated, is that the teams have got data. The Chevrolet teams will have seen plenty of data from Penske over the course of the first few races, and obviously there's a Chevrolet engineer working on the cars. So I think maybe you're probably a better person to sort of address that, JR, but I think, at least from my understanding from the outside as well, that this is not necessarily something that you go back and like go into absolute minute detail on, that this would be like something that was totally obvious. Yes, if you had a data sheet and you were being told to look for this sort of situation, you would be able to see it immediately and it would be obvious. I think the data aspect is an interesting one, because if you were looking close enough, you probably could see this happening. Maybe it would have been avoided and someone would have pointed this out earlier. But I think to call people incompetent and to say that they should have spotted this on the data before is maybe a little bit short-sighted, in the sense that that's not necessarily how these kind of things work.
You know, in my mind, like, one of the plausible and not great look scenarios is they sort of at some point knew that they had an advantage and didn't say anything about it. As far as I'm concerned, like, that's just like, anybody would do that. Like, what the hell is everybody like? Have we forgotten that we're going racing and this is like a bunch of people competing against each other? Like, you don't go racing because you're the most honest people on the planet, okay? Like, you're always looking for some way to beat the other guys, and if you've got like a free pass to do that in a way that the other guys don't, like, then you try to milk that shit for as long as you can, you know? And this is where the double standard of Penske and the you know, entrapment basically that they get into as a racing team, because Roger owns the series and it seems like everybody hates them, like, becomes problematic in this whole situation. And that's their own fault and their own situation. Like, this is a Penske, you live and die on that hill if you're racing for Penske or whatever. But I guess I bring that up more or less just to say that I feel like we've just got like a weird set of, because maybe it's because there's just enough built up tension within the series right now about all of this other stuff like that. I'm sure that that's not totally unrelated to the level of internal you know, whatever gas that's being thrown on the fire in this whole situation. But I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of like, okay, can we whittle this back down to what actually happened, which is that like a couple of guys used a couple of seconds worth of push to pass on restarts, and they like were pretty overt about it. There's just no way that this is as scandalous as everybody thinks it is, and I can tell you without question that if I was racing for a team and we had figured out how to do this, we would be trying to figure out how to continue doing it without anybody knowing about it. Like, and every team, if anybody on a team told you that that's not what they would do, they're just full of shit. Like, you'd have to be really convinced that somebody for sure was going to find out, and you know, whatever, which is maybe a silly reason for somebody to have not self-reported. I guess I do find it kind of hard to believe that nobody realized, like nobody across any of the people that are on the timing stand and whatever else, that nobody realized this was going on and that they couldn't. But that you also get into like, that's even a nuanced situation. Like, let's say it's, you know, third man down on the totem pole is realizing that this is a thing that's, you know, not supposed to be happening. What's the relationship that guy has with that guy or gal has with Tim Cindric? You know, like, do they want to be the one, you know, Tim's saying over the radio, hey, the rules have changed, and then you've got push to pass that's working, and, you know, whatever is the dynamic there such that it's an open enough conversation for that person to go and say, hey, I don't know. There's a lot of things that there's a lot of things basically in this whole discussion that assume that these organizations are just these insanely well-oiled machines, when the reality of it is just that there's more like chaos going on behind the scenes at all of these places just to show up and be ready for the next race than I think often like is visible from the outside. And so there's just human error like built into all of that and whatever. So I don't know. I guess that's just kind of where I'm at with the whole thing.
Yeah, I think I agree on the self-reporting, because I still don't think we've had a good enough explanation from Scott McLaughlin or the team, because his story is that he pressed the button and realised that it was on and didn't press it again. So why then was that not communicated any further? So I think that's something we're still yet to hear a proper answer on. Speaking of Scott, we should mention that he won the race at the weekend. Just briefly kind of summing up the race, because it was quite complicated, even though he was on pole and won the race last year and was also on the pole and won the race this year. This one was a little bit more complicated because of what we've seen at Barber in recent years, which is, I feel like it's one of the most aggressive tracks on the calendar for being able to like mess up either a 2-stop or a 3-stop. Like there's really no clear option here in terms of what to do, and Scott's committed to the 3-stop in both years and won both years, so hindsight would tell you that he made the right decision. But his race kind of almost fell apart around the lap, was it the lap 47 caution, where he got relegated to 17th place and still needed to make another stop like Alex Palou did. So Palou was leading at that point, or was in the net lead of that strategy, let's say the 2-stop strategy, and Scott's kind of massive lead that he'd built up over those guys who were trying to play out for the 2-stop earlier in the race had completely gone because of that caution. And he was like, he was going to have to fight his way back through the field. Even though those guys were going to have to save some fuel, he was still going to have a struggle on his hands to get back up from 17th to the race win. And then that magical caution came out at lap 57, which was 3 laps short of the 2-stop guys being able to get to the end. So then they had to pit and then massively fuel save for the final stint. So that's what kind of boosted Scott back into contention, along with World Power, who went off early on in the race but still managed to turn that into a 2nd place. And Linus Lundqvist had committed to that strategy as well. One of the few people kind of remaining who committed to the strategy and stayed on it, didn't bail out, and had the pace ultimately because he had a fresh set of soft tyres left at the end and was able to carve his way through the field. And shout out to Felix Rosenqvist as well, because he passed Alex Palou on that, on the same strategy late in the race as well to take his spot. So Rosenqvist in the top 10 in every race so far this year. And Colton Herta was getting banged about by Santino Ferrucci in the early part of the race, but also managed to rebound to 8th, and that puts him in the lead of the championship after all of this.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I think some people would say that the most interesting aspect of the Barber race came about an hour after the race had finished, when David Malukas was told that he wouldn't be racing again for Arrow McLaren this year. So in some ways, a kind of weird situation where the last two drivers they've signed have not gone on to race for the team, because we had Alex Palou, stating that he was going to join McLaren, and then now those two are kind of embroiled in a court case now, and that he's obviously stayed at Ganassi. And then David Malukas, his replacement, is obviously not going to race for the team either. So a kind of bizarre situation for McLaren. Before you even factor in that they also had an injury to Sam Bird in the Formula E race and had to replace him with somebody in the Formula E race as well. So a kind of wild chain of events going on at McLaren. Let's get into this, JR. I think... just to explain what happened, if you've not listened to the podcast at all this year or followed this story, David Malukas fell off his mountain bike in the pre-season and has not been able to race since then. So he's missed 4 races, and according to kind of sources in the paddock, he had McLaren had like a 4-race break clause basically that allowed them to kind of part ways with David Malukas. I'm kind of intrigued by this because I think, from what I understand, is there's kind of a legal element to this in the sense that there's a 4-race break clause, and if McLaren didn't break the clause at that point, then if they'd have committed to him and then parted ways with him further down the line, that might have given David and his team some sort of like legal avenue to pursue, in the sense that McLaren had kind of committed to him at that point beyond the 4 races. They could have got rid of him, but didn't. In this hypothetical scenario, and then if they drop him later down the line, that's a bad look when it comes to McLaren for kind of stringing David along a little bit. So maybe some sort of legal angle to this in terms of how this has played out when it has. Obviously, from the outside, I can understand people finding this extremely difficult to kind of compute and accept, really, from this guy's injured, hasn't driven in the car, and is now out of the team. I guess also fans not particularly happy that this is a team that has kind of, an interesting history when it comes to injuries. Oliver Askew was dropped when he was recovering from a concussion. And we hear a lot about the team trying to push, improving mental health and doing, people forward things, trying to make this a really nice place to work. And I don't think it sets the best example for people who get injured that this is, how this has ended up. But on the other side, you can understand from a sponsorship point of view that they want a continuous driver in the car. They don't want to see the team's fortune slip. And it's been a really tough start to the year on track for McLaren, even if one of the stand-ins, Teo Borcher, delivered that 12th place on his debut, and Callum Ilott was 11th in that car as well to start the year. It's been very up and down, and I think Tony Kanaan, the sporting director there, has not been able to maybe spend as much time with the current drivers as he would have liked to, while he's been trying to help David with his recovery. So a lot to unpack there and a lot to get into in this story, and I'm sure it's not the end that we're going to hear. We'll talk about the anticipated replacements in a minute. Do you have any general feeling about this, JR, before we get into a bit more detail?
Yeah, I think, the first thing, I have a lot of sympathy for David in this situation. It sucks for him, just regardless of kind of how you look at it. Yes, it was an off-track thing that kind of resulted in this injury, and that's for him is a particularly unfortunate aspect of this, and it probably does factor into I don't know the language of the contract, but every contract that I've had, there is sort of a clause that injuries get treated somewhat differently if they're in the car versus out of the car, in terms of how that affects the way that the team is allowed to address your contract. And so it wouldn't surprise me if this 4-race thing, I was kind of reading into that a little bit, and it was a little unclear, frankly, and we might not really know unless somebody just told us directly. But it made me wonder if it had to have been the first 4 races, or if it's basically just if David missed any 4 races due to something that wasn't an on-track, issue. It wouldn't surprise me to see modern contracts written somewhat in that kind of language. A lot of the contracts that I've had, they've been a little bit more vague. Like, it's kind of just the team's call if they deem however you got hurt to be something that you didn't really need to be doing. There are contracts and teams that are much more explicit in terms of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Andretti was, I think, famous for some period of time, basically because Dario was there and got hurt, like broke his back riding his Ducati or something, and so they they started writing this, really explicit language, like there is no snowmobiling allowed. There is no, like all of this stuff that you just can't do. Like if they find out that you've been doing any of this stuff, they can just instantly void your contract, whether you got hurt or not. But that most contracts are less explicit and a little bit more kind of performance oriented. Like if you actually end up missing time, which missing time could even be as simple as missing sim days and stuff, that because of an injury that the team deems like sort of quote unquote unnecessary in essence, like not because you got hurt in the car somehow. That you get into any driver, I think, given any contract at this point, would be in some kind of hot water in terms of, where they sort of stand relative to the team. So I say that just to say, it sounds like I'd be surprised if that wasn't a factor in terms of this whole 4-race thing and whatever else. Now, I guess sort of shifting to, you mentioned that Gavin Ward and these guys at Arrow McLaren, as the team is now, it's certainly a different team than it was when Oliver was around.
Yeah.
And Hinch before that and whatever. So to sort of give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt in the situation, the piece of information that we just don't have is what is actually the state of David's injury and recovery. Like, we don't know what that is. And there's kind of two different versions of that. One is you take some of the things that David and like Tony Kanaan have said at face value, which is, oh, he could be ready to go next weekend. Personally, I think that's just that's overreaction in the opposite direction, because they kind of knew that this was coming down the pike, and they want to sort of do a little bit of a, diversion, basically, to allow this to actually play out the way the team wants it to play out in terms of the messaging and comms about this whole contract situation. That he's still in a brace. Like, if you're still in a brace like this, you're not ready to be in the car next weekend. Like, there's just no way. There's another version of this, which is that it's actually bad enough that realistically he wouldn't get in the car for the rest of the year or something. And that I don't know that. We don't know that. David and the team probably are the only people and his doctors are really the only people that know exactly what the scenario is here. But I guess I bring that up because, one, we talked about just the way that they're sort of addressing the fill-in situation, seeming a little bit more as if that's the case, like that they've kind of been treating this as a more long-term thing that they've got to deal with, as opposed to just who's the best guy for this upcoming race that we have as a fill-in to show up and jump in the car. The decision-making that they've been doing race to race has not reflected that kind of attitude, in my opinion. And that, I guess, ultimately, in these kinds of situations, I think teams, particularly in the IndyCar series, I feel like, and maybe that's just because I don't have a lot of insight into the way that this works in NASCAR or Formula One. In Formula One, at least in Europe, it just from the outside seems to me like there's a little bit more transparency in terms of what's going on with guys from a health perspective or whatever. On our side of the fence, I would say almost every situation where there's been a driver injury over the last like 10 or 15 years that I've been around, I feel like it's been, for one reason or another, purposefully sort of underreported, basically, by the team and the driver. That there's this kind of weird, as a driver, the reason that you might underreport something is because you don't want to like admit to some level of vulnerability in terms of, oh, this might be something that's actually, I'm not Superman here. Like I'm not maybe going to be at my best for some period of time. You kind of don't want people to know that. There's a part of just the essence of being a driver and showing up at Indianapolis and these kinds of places that you sort of feel like you've got to be super brave. And so that psychologically somehow is whether it's conscious or kind of subconscious, like feeds the way that you talk about, you sort of just like blow stuff off like, it's not that big of a deal. I've been in this situation a number of times. You don't want people to know that you're kind of battling through something when you are. And I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, I can say that ends up screwing you most of the time, because a lot of times you are battling through something that is affecting your performance, and it would actually be better for people to know that it's affecting your performance in some way and you're battling through it, than to be expecting that you're as 100% as you're saying that you are and not performing quite at the level that you might otherwise be. For teams, I guess I would say for teams, often like they can't report beyond what the driver is reporting. So in this particular situation, like if David doesn't want people to know that everything's actually really jacked, the team can't come out and say as a reason for why they're axing him now that that's a part of the reason why they're axing him. And so I guess that was kind of a long-winded way of just saying there's a version of this here where the team and David both know that, like, this is actually a lot worse than either of them is letting on. That would benefit the team in this point more, to be able to come out and say, hey, we're making this decision basically on the back of knowing that we're not going to have this guy meaningfully in the car for the rest of the year. And so we got to like get it together. But if David isn't saying that and he doesn't want them to say that, they can't break that confidentiality with him because it's about his health ultimately. And so they're kind of left in this weird middle ground that it just sort of seems like they're cutting the guy loose. So I don't know, like I feel like that's in this particular situation. I don't always think that this is the case. I think generally speaking, teams and drivers don't handle these situations very well. It's rare that you kind of get the feeling that they're on the same page and they're really working together in terms of communicating this kind of stuff. I thought the same thing with Pagano and Shank last year. At the end of the year, it was kind of like, it's a different situation because he had, the injury was in the car and not out of the car, but ultimately kind of the same result, which is just like suddenly the team's hired Bloomquist and Rosenquist for 2024. And like, you're sort of sitting there like, well, what? Like, are you just totally screwing this guy? And then I guess I would say, I don't know that much about Simon's situation as it sits right now, but the fact that he hasn't been in a race car of any kind this year kind of makes you think like, okay, well, he's still battling through this. Like he's still getting right. And if that's the case, then that's probably why Shank made the decisions that they did, but they can't just come out and say that. So, I think at the end of the day, it's as big of like a comms kind of, it's not an issue, but just, it's difficulty associated with the communication of this whole thing as much as it is the decision-making process. My guess is the decision-making process is built on some hard evidence that made the team really think like, we just don't really have an option at this point. And some of that is down to the contractual situation, like the legal ramifications of continuing to let it go. But, I guess my guess is that this is a little bit more cut and dry kind of than it looks. That could be wrong. They could just be, very coldly like, we've got to get it together now. And so we're making a serious business decision here. But I'm guessing that it's at least somewhere in between.
Yeah. I guess the other element we don't know, without having heard from David properly on this, apart from a kind of short statement, is that if he felt like he was going to be sidelined further down the line, then maybe he wanted the break so that he's able to find his way back to IndyCar in some way that allows him to, move to another team in a way that means he isn't some sort of ambassador or some sort of reserve driver for McLaren for a lengthy period when he could be out there looking for another team and finding his way back to the series. That's something else we don't know. And a lot of the reason why we don't know things is because we still don't know how long this recovery is, and everything we've heard from the team is that it's been kind of day to day and evaluating in that sense. It's kind of weird that he had a procedure earlier this week, and then this kind of news comes out almost immediately after that, which again, you could draw different conclusions from that as to what it means for, when he's going to be back and how long he's going to be out for. It's a really difficult story to approach, and it's as you said, I think even though these drivers, you're in the spotlight, and you accept that there's a certain amount of media attention and stuff about your life that's disclosed that you maybe don't want to, you still deserve a certain level of privacy in these situations where you're trying to come back to full health, because that's what it is at the end of the day. It's health. It's not just it's not just a performance aspect of this, it's a health aspect. So yeah, well, I'm sure we'll hear more from David and from the team. I'm sure the team will be eager to, because the team knew that this was not going to go down well in the kind of public eye, and the kind of way they've come out and said it. I'm sure they didn't want to do it that way, and it's not, this is not their primary situation or goal to have David out of the car and to put someone else in it, but that's just how it is. So we'll have to keep an eye on this one. It's going to be one that develops and changes, and I think the next sort of element of this story is going to be who ends up replacing David for the season. I think there's some obvious choices in the sense that Théo Pourchaire and Callum Ilott have both been in the car. Both of those guys have got complications in the sense that they both have other series that they're competing in. So no single one of those drivers could do the rest of the season for McLaren. It would have to be a combination of the two of them doing the rest of the races. So that's interesting in itself, how it'll divide it all up. And in most cases, it's decided for them because there's clashes. But for Detroit, for Mid-Ohio, for Gateway, they would have to choose between Ilott or Pourchaire. So that in itself is interesting. There's also the possibility that McLaren could try to get one of these drivers to get out of their other deals in order to race for them full time, and the prospect of being offered a full time McLaren seat in any series is going to be a draw for any driver, I guess, or most drivers. So they'll have a lot of sway and power with that. So it'll be interesting to see if either of those two end up actually taking the seat full time, and then if they pull another driver out of somewhere. So that'll be interesting to see as well. I think, well, I know Callum Ilott is going to do the Indy 500 for the team, and I'm pretty sure Théo Pourchaire is going to do the Indy road course because Callum's in WEC at Spa for that weekend. So I think that's probably how it's going to work for the next two rounds. But then we've got a choice between Ilott or Pourchaire for Detroit, so that's going to be interesting to see how that kind of unfolds. The other interesting aspect of this to me is the kind of the team status starting the year, and I guess that's almost exclusively down to Pato in some ways, because he's obviously won a race now. He's ended that winless streak, but the last two races have been a bit of a trash can fire for him, haven't they? In the sense that he took Alexander Rossi out of the Long Beach race, and then followed that up in Barber by almost smashing into the back of Christian Lundgaard. Then he hit Pietro Fittipaldi, and then he spun Théo Pourchaire at the end of the race. Like, three separate incidents in that race. I think I've made it very clear on the pod that I'm a massive fan of Pato and his natural talent and raw ability, but I think what we're seeing at the minute is the exact reason why McLaren tried so hard to sign Palou, and that their driver lineup is not currently lined up for them to be in a position where they fight against Ganassi and Penske and Andretti, because Pato is the only one who seems to be able to get the most out of the car in a qualifying scenario, so that he's usually the only driver who's in a strategy position to take it to those people. But then in the race, he's struggling to, at least the last two races, struggling to show the level of consistency that's needed to put the team at the front. And then we've not seen the same level of qualifying performance from either of the other two drivers who've been in the car over the course of the season, Alexander Rossi, Théo Pourchaire. And I mean, Théo Pourchaire and Callum Ilott, you can't hold them to the same situation. Ilott's done one race in the car, and it was his first race with the team, and Pourchaire's done two races. The first one was his first time driving an IndyCar, so it's just a bit of a mess in that sense to start the season for them. And it at least looks like looking at the St. Pete win, looking at where Pato's qualified, in Barber and St. Pete, that there's pace in the car, and that they're obviously close to the sharp end, but it just seems like that driver lineup's not it's just not there at the minute, and it's not ready to fight at the front. And I think that's a problem for McLaren, because every year that ticks over here, people are expecting more and more from this team, and they've been very honest about the fact that they need to invest in things like the equipment they use on a race weekend. Like Gavin Ward's obviously come from Penske and seen what they are working with, and doesn't feel like McLaren are up to that level yet. But there's just kind of like the basic aspect of executing weekends, properly. And, Pato spoke about this in the off season, that, there was a lot of weekends last year where races were taken away from him, and that there was, mechanical issues, reliability issues, stuff like that. But the last two races have been, you can't put the blame anywhere else other than on Pato for the past two races. And that's now two races that he's finished outside of the top 15, which, Alex Palou didn't do last year, and Scott Dixon, I think, did once or twice maybe, but very infrequently. So, yeah, I think this whole situation's kind of, the whole Malukas situation has really kind of added gas to the fire in this situation, that the lineup's just not quite where it needs to be at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that for sure. It's hard to know. It's hard to know how much of a distraction. Like the David situation for sure is a distraction. There's no way, if you just got another driver walking around in your whatever pits at the track that doesn't really have a really obvious reason for being there, given the performance execution of a weekend, it's a distraction. How much that is affecting anybody in particular is hard to know. It's probably not a lot. But just the uncertainty associated with that is definitely problematic for a team that's, to your point, kind of like right on the edge of, and has the expectation of like competing with the Penskes and Ganassi's race weekend to race weekend, and kind of isn't quite, to your point, like isn't quite actually doing that. We expect that they'll be good at the Speedway because they were really good at the Speedway last year and have been for a few years now. So I think that at this point, they're probably just anxious to get to the oval. And, it's worth noting that not as if I necessarily look at McLaren and think they're going to be better than Penske and Ganassi on the oval races for this year. They will be better. They will certainly be better as a group than they have been up to this point. And that being good on the oval there's a little bit more about that on any kind of particular oval that tends to manifest like more consistently through a weekend than road and street course pace being kind of like a little bit all over the place. Like you could be good in a practice session at street course and then not qualify in the top 10. It's a little bit more rare that if all three cars, or at least whoever's in the third car, if at least Pato and Rossi show up to a bunch of the oval tracks this year and are like pretty good right out of the box, chances are those guys will be competing up towards the front for the entirety of those race weekends. So there's a chance for them, just because there's so many oval races on the schedule, and they've shown a lot of pace at those places or in those types of tracks, over the past few years, that things level out a little bit more towards the end of the year for them. But I would agree that it feels like this is a team that's sort of fighting against having another we're using this year to get to the next year kind of situation. That they've had the expectation that like they should start to be able to truly compete for championships on just outright performance at this point. And the way the start of this season has gone thus far, to your point, just hasn't really indicated quite that level of performance. And whether that's cars, drivers, strategies, like whatever. But there's a lot going on, and it doesn't seem like they're quite firing on all cylinders at this point.
I think there's definitely an element of like working out how to move forward with this car and how to get the best out of the drivers that are in it. Because I mean, there's two elements to this. You look at Felix Rosenqvist, and he's ahead of Pato O'Ward in the points, having scored 4 top 10s to start the season, if you include Thermal, in a team that had 1 top 10 last year across 2 cars. So I mean, there's improvement, and then there's like whoa. But Felix is he's been criticised heavily for being regularly behind Pato and not in the same kind of, not really in the same league as Pato for a lot of his McLaren career, and then, maybe shortening that gap and becoming a bit closer. But, Felix Rosenqvist didn't forget how to drive, and the fact that he's ahead of Pato in the points now after, 3 races it shows that there's still a driver in there and that there's someone capable of very good results. And I think Alexander Rossi's maybe even taken a step forward from last year in his performances to start the season, because he was, he's been top 10 the first 2 races, and then I think he probably would have been in and around the top 10 in Barber as well if it wasn't for the pit stop problem where the wheel came off after he'd left the pits, and that probably would have put him ahead of Pato. So the problem is we're dealing with such a small sample set at the moment that it's difficult to draw too many conclusions or develop too many kind of themes off the back of it. But I just think it's really interesting that I think that team is the most interesting on the grid in terms of like from a driver perspective, because Pato's beaten so many teammates, but then, some of those drivers have at least, shown in other equipment or in other series that they haven't just like forgotten how to drive, or have just, it's their end of their career or something. They've, been able to rebound, I guess Felix being the example. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the next few races go for them. And like you said, the 500 is going to be a big one. I think Felix and Pato last year at McLaren both felt like they had the car to win that race. Whether you believe them or not is your call, but they were both up there fighting, weren't they? And both kind of crashed out. So be interesting to see how both of them get on this year, especially Felix now being at Maishank that won the race in 2021. So that'll definitely be an interesting storyline to watch. Barber, I mean, I think we've tried our best to try and fit as much as we can into an hour. I think we mentioned Lundqvist podium, Herta jump into the lead of the points, and Felix's strong starts of the year with his top 10s. I think Colton is worth just a quick mention because, well, he's worth more than a quick mention, but we're obviously fighting against time. I think, I'm probably one of the, at least on this podcast, I've quite regularly said that Colton, I think needs to be more consistent and needs to kind of marry that strong pace that he's able to produce with consistency. And there's always been an element of wondering how much that is Andretti and how much of it is Colton. And we've definitely seen Colton have some really strong results taken away from him with things outside of his control, whether that's from team like pit stop and strategy or mechanical issues or stuff like that. So it's definitely not all his fault, but I definitely feel like we've never really seen that blend of pace and consistency, kind of like I guess what we were talking about with Pato in a certain way. But this has been a really strong start to the year, and it's dawned on me being in the press conferences for the first few races that like anytime Colton's there, he almost always gets asked some sort of question that's framed as like, you didn't have a very good 2023. How does it feel to start the year like this? And you can just imagine like Colton's like deadpan response and his kind of his interpretation of that just being quite kind of like I guess funny in reply to that. But it's clear he's had to put up with a lot of people talking about his performances, how he's done, the fact that he's arguably the highest paid driver in the series, and has he done enough to deserve that, and does he have the resume to deserve that? I think the Pato, and again, has been another person who's had that kind of thrown his way after his contract rise last year. But I think again we're getting into the territory of there not being enough races to kind of get a good sample set. But Colton has been the top Andretti driver in all 3 of the points paying races so far, and was super impressive at Thermal as well in that kind of off sequence weird strategy that he ran where he drove like a grandma around the back for the first installment of the final. But what have you seen from him? Is there do you think it is sort of soon enough to say that we're seeing like a different kind of approach from Colton or a different level of performance, or do you want to see a few more races now where we kind of really get into this and work it out?
I think, reading between the lines, some of the things that he has said over the course of just getting those questions that seems to have been like peppered with at a lot of, in a lot of media availability. One of the things that he's been pretty upfront about basically is just the fact that, yeah, he was just not having a good time last year, basically. And I guess to me, we talked about this a lot on the pod, so we won't, I don't feel like this is necessary for us to dig too deep into. But I think the first part of sort of overcoming that is just realizing that you were even going through it, and realize, he's clearly recognized that that was affecting his performance. Just like the fact that there was, he wasn't performing at a high level. And so that was kind of making him, push a little too hard and not really enjoying it and whatever. And then that just makes it worse, basically. Like, so you you can get in this spiral that we've talked to a number of drivers that have sort of expressed the fact that that occurred for them. And we've talked to a number of drivers that have basically said it's hard to pull yourself out of that. And I've had this experience, like it's hard to pull yourself out of that while you're going through it in season. And so he's kind of got to the off season last year, was able to remove himself enough from everything that was going on to reflect on where he was at and what was going on, and the fact that that was impacting, kind of just his whole vibe, basically driving the car, and that's important. So whatever he's done to address that, maybe it's just simply recognizing it. That seems to have, at least, I'm sure that's had some impact, basically, just at least from the end of last year to the beginning of this year. To your point, like how that materializes for the rest of the season in terms of, is that representative of him turning a new leaf, kind of, in terms of, being able to consistently find really that perfect combination of assertiveness, aggressiveness, we'll say, but sort of awareness, for like situational awareness, I think, is the thing that you kind of have to counter all of that with. Like when I, watching Pato at Thermal, or at Barber, was a little bit like, okay, he's got like a weird mismatch of being super assertive, but not having a lot of situational awareness here in terms of like, where are we actually at in the race? How quick do I need to make this pass right this second? Am I actually in a position to pull this off? Or am I just so hell bent on getting by this guy that like I'm ignoring my reality, basically, for the moment, and just trying to push for things that aren't there. And in the IndyCar series right now, it just the difference between getting that perfectly right and executing, and getting that a little bit wrong and having everything go to shit, is very small. So it's like, I don't sit here and fault these guys for having the odd race where it's kind of like that. But I think that's essentially what's sort of occurring when we do see that. So it seems like thus far that Colton's, found a little bit more of the headspace that we tend to associate with your Alex Palou's and, Dixon's and McLaughlin's when they're really dialed and all this kind of stuff, which is letting things kind of come to them, but still ripping the lap, and kind of maybe more allowing for the race to come to them however it's going to come to them. We heard that from Josef at the beginning of this year, kind of trying to make that adjustment. So anyway, yeah, I think certainly you'd say that it's a difference for Colton from last year to this year. And we'll see how it kind of continues to play out. He's to me, for the last 3 years or something, probably been the wild card for, just to bring up the fact that the schedule is full of ovals for the rest of the season. Like he's to me been the guy that on any given oval race seems like he could have Newgarden's number, basically. He's been the most obvious candidate in my mind to challenge Josef on like a regular basis, showing up at oval races. So he's definitely one to watch. We didn't see that as much last year, but the years prior, he was kind of like the only non-Penske car that seemed like he was really genuinely in the mix for poles, front rows, podiums, whatever, particularly going to a lot of short oval tracks that we'll continue to see a lot of this season.
I don't know if I would agree that he would be Josef's closest contender, but he's definitely one of the drivers who's had the worst fortune at oval races, as we've found out by having him on the pod before. And we will try and get Colton on in the next week or so because it's been a little while since we had him on last, and it'll be great to kind of get an idea of how he's feeling after the start to the season. I think it's worth just like props to Andretti as well for the start that they've had, and I think Kirkwood's had 3 top 10s to start the year. Colton's obviously had 3 top 10s, but 2 podiums in that, and I think Marcus would have been top 6 probably in St. Pete had he not had the engine issue, or let's just say for argument's sake that would have been a top 10. He was 5th in Long Beach and really strong there. His qualifying performances have been notable as well. And then Barber, I think the race fell apart a little bit through contact towards the end of the race, but good start for him as well to his new kind of Andretti career. And yeah, I think it looks that I hope this doesn't come across in the wrong way, but like the biggest compliment that I could pay them is that they've been quite under the radar in how they've kind of gone about the first 3 races, and that's just because they haven't made any high profile errors really from my memory, and they've seemed to have gone about everything in a really sensible way. And anytime you see a kind of incident where you think, oh, this is sketchy, it's been pretty straightforward. Kirkwood got a bit banged about a bit in Barber and gave it out to Newgarden as well at one point. And, we saw Colton getting hit twice by Ferrucci, but all kind of incidents where I feel like those drivers could have retaliated or put themselves in a worse position than they did and kind of just rode the wave a little bit there and just came through. Just general kind of situations like that where I feel like they've just been quite improved in areas where they might not have been before.
The only thing that I would add to that is just that I've been reflecting on this a little bit, just watching some of the races and having just totally independently having the same, having the same feeling basically that, these guys they're just going out there and doing their thing. And it seems like it's all sort of working basically. That, one of the things that I think is potentially a significant part of that is that now we talked about this preseason, but they are just down to this 3-driver lineup. And the one thing that I think is common about all 3 of those guys, Kirkwood, Herta, and Marcus, is that they're all like pretty easygoing, relatively low ego guys. Like they all have a lot of self-belief and confidence in what they're doing. And so there's situations where that is more overt than in others. But like, I think those are all 3 guys. I don't know any of the 3 of those guys super well, but they're all guys that would just sit there and like shoot the breeze with you if you saw them like walking through the paddock. Like they're easygoing, and it sort of you think about how that sort of manifests within a team. That when you're 3, the drivers are the guys that are getting in and going, doing the thing. So when those guys all have a pretty even keel, they're all, I get the feeling that the vibe within that camp right now that's kind of starts with the drivers is probably just, we're just showing up and here to like get down to business basically. And that there's not like an overly seriousness about that. It's not like they're all showing up, we got to do the X, Y, or Z this weekend. They're all kind of guys that I get the sense they're kind of just, they show up, they know what they have to do. They're responsible about the things that they have to bring to the table. And they bring a fairly measured approach to doing that. And it just feels like that's sort of translated in some sense to the way that the 3 of them just as independent entities and entries out on tracks sort of seem to be operating this year.
Well, we'll keep an eye on how Andretti get on. The next race is the Indianapolis Road Course, as I mentioned, and then we're into the month of May and the Indy 500. So that'll definitely be big topics of conversation on our pod. So thanks very much for listening. I hope we've got through a lot of the topics to cover. A bit of a shame that those 2 massive news stories overshadowed pretty much doing a proper deep dive into this Barber race, but I'm sure we'll pick up some of the kind of themes that are developing from the early part of the season and some of the things that happened at Barber in our upcoming episodes that will be coming soon. So keep an eye on the pod. We'll be dropping soon, and we'll be back with another episode of the Race IndyCar podcast.
The Athletic.